Sorry about the technical difficulties. We have played videos on here before, and they've worked perfectly. So Larry is very, very good at winging it, and he will be able to go even without the slide presentation, but I apologize for that. So this is about the Underground Railroad. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started, I guess. Take a look, make sure you take a look around the Heritage Center if you haven't been here before. We've got our displays all kind of shoved against the wall, but you can still get an idea of it. We are Facebook Living this. This is again our first time doing that, so it's a little bit of a work in progress. But if you could please, during the presentation, not talk, because the camera, the TV is, or the phone is kind of sensitive and it's going to pick you up as opposed to picking up Larry. What else? Anything else I should be saying?
Where are we at?
We are at the Monee Heritage Center in Fireman's Park on Court Street. This is the newly renovated home of the Monee Historical Society, and it is not a museum, it is a part of our cultural heritage where we're going to be doing programming like this, changing out the displays, and we are always very excited at the prospect of anybody who would like to volunteer. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Larry McClellan. Larry is... It's all right.
My books.
Yes. Dr. Larry McClellan graduated from the University of Chicago. His research focuses on the Underground Railroad in Illinois, and he was instrumental in gaining listings on the Network to Freedom National Register of Underground Railroad sites for sites in Crete and Lockport. His consulting, research, and writing focus on historic highways, the Underground Railroad in Illinois, and on African American and regional history south of Chicago. Major publications include 25 articles in the Encyclopedia of Chicago, the Pontiac Trail, Route 66, and the early Chicago to St. Louis roads. The Underground Railroad south of Chicago, and co-author of The Remarkable Journey of Carolyn Quayle's A Freedom Seeker on the Underground Railroad. His latest book, Barefoot to Chicago, Freedom Seekers and the Underground Railroad in Northeastern Illinois, will be published in 1922. He's been a speaker with us before, and he knows that it's our hope and passion that one day we find an Underground Railroad site in Monee. Seeing that we were on the Illinois Central, that was a route for a lot of freedom seekers from the South, especially St. Louis. On that, but let me introduce Dr. McClellan.
Great, thank you. I'm assuming it's okay. I've had my shots and boosters and everything. It's okay to be a lot easier for me to hear and for you to hear and also to see me, I suppose. Well, I'm sorry about the pictures. Because since I was with you all, and some of you were here a year or so ago, I've got a bunch of new pictures that I got, and I was going to show you some new stuff, but I'm going to try to talk about those things, and I'm going to just kind of do this on the fly, and hope that I can, that you all can stay with us. So, what we're talking about, what I've been looking at for the last 30 years or so, is how do we understand this thing called the Underground Railroad in America? When I helped to start Governor State University, Lord, 51 years ago, I was 12 at the time. When we started Governor State, because of my involvement with racial justice issues, I was very much interested in learning about the historic black communities south of Chicago. So I started getting acquainted with people in Robbins and Fort Heights and the historic neighborhoods in Harvey and Chicago Heights. And as I was doing that, I ran into references to this thing called the Underground Railroad. And I was thinking, oh, I know about that. That's the fugitive slaves went north, and that was on the East Coast. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. And why are they talking about it in Illinois? And that started the trek. And I looked at it kind of along the way for about 20 years. And then about 30 years ago, I started getting serious about it. And in fact, the end result is that it is now very clear, and I am making the argument nationally, that the stories of Illinois need to be included in the national story of the Underground Railroad. Currently, it is not. Illinois is basically ignored. and that we need to really tell that, and in fact, probably 10 to 15% of the activity of the Underground Railroad came through Illinois, came through northeastern Illinois, right? Literally through our backyards. So there are stories that need to be told. Now, to begin with, part of what we have to change is the way that we talk about this, because historically, in Illinois, the Underground Railroad had been stories about the people that helped. And we have to turn that upside down and really begin with talking about people that have the determination and the courage to seize their own freedom. And so the story of the Underground Railroad absolutely has to always be the story of freedom seekers, the fugitive slaves who seized their freedom, freedom seekers, and the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was the resulting network. For decades, people had liberated themselves and come north and ran into well-meaning people who wanted to help. And it was in that encounter that the Underground Railroad developed. The networks of support developed in response to the need. As people with their families, their children were traveling north, sometimes they asked for help, and so people started giving help. And then the people that were assisting freedom seekers started to connect with each other, and that's how the networks developed. Now, if you think, for example, the dominant story puts it the other way. You know, follow the drinking gourd. The old man is a-comin' for to carry you to freedom. That's that old image. You know, the good white folks and the good black folks that help the poor slaves. And we got to turn that around. You know, and that it really should be, the old man is waiting when you seize your freedom. So follow the drinking gourd. We have to change this whole story. So it's always about freedom seekers, people going to find their own way out of slavery, and then the networks of support that develop. And that's what happened in Illinois. Now, before we begin that, the kind of the stories, I always, and it's reflected in the images that I would show you, it's always important to remember the incredible seriousness of slavery. We do not understand it. And I would challenge anyone, if you think you know what slavery is, you know, we don't. How can we imagine what it means for one human being to own another human being and to have total control over that person's life? It's a very, very strange phenomenon. And we've got to realize that slavery was just embedded in the South, and there were all kinds of people that decided that for the sake of their families, the sake of their children, for the sake of their own sanity, they had to liberate themselves. And a dear friend of mine says we really should call them freedom seizers, because these are folks that seize their freedom. But that's too hard to say. I'm okay with freedom seekers. But the point being, these are lots of folks in the South. Now, they didn't just come north. They went to Mexico. They went west to live with native peoples. They went into the Caribbean. There were people along the East Coast that commandeered ships and found their way to freedom. In all kinds of ways, a couple 100,000 people in the years before the Civil War tried to find their freedom. And here in Illinois, there were people coming through out of the South starting in the 1820s. We know that as the state was formed in 1818, already there were people coming out of the southern states, and they were just doing it on their own. They were just heading north. And people, for the most part, followed the Mississippi River north, and then they got up beyond St. Louis, and they followed either on the river or next to it. They followed the Illinois River, and the Illinois River kind of arcs toward Chicago. And then once they got to places like Ottawa and LaSalle County, that part, they then headed east. And there are two broad streams of movement for folks. There were folks that went up from the Illinois River, went up following the corridor of the I&M Canal up to Chicago. And then there were others that went straight east across Will County and southern Cook. They were following the old Sauk Trail, that corridor. My research suggests that somewhere between 6,000 to 10,000 people came into Illinois seeking their freedom, that escaping from enslavement. And those that came up into northeastern Illinois, my research supports the notion of between 3,000 and 4,500 people came through northeastern Illinois on their way to freedom. And for some stayed in Chicago, some stayed in some of our towns for a while, but the vast majority were on their way. Chicago was a way station. Northeastern Illinois was a way station because they were all headed for Detroit, because they had to get to Detroit so they could get to Canada. Because the great dilemma of America was that if you wanted to be a free person, you had to leave the land of the free. And that particularly after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it got very, very serious, very dangerous for freedom seekers, and always fairly dangerous for those people that were helping them. So a huge number came through. And again, I'm just aching that I don't have my maps and stuff that I can show you all this stuff. But so if you think about folks coming into northeastern Illinois, there were two broad avenues of movement. One was following the corridor of the I&M Canal, and later on, actually, folks were on the I&M Canal, going up to Chicago itself. And then from Chicago, remember, Chicago was, in the 1840s and 50s, about the size of the Loop. I mean, Chicago was a little town. And people had to then go straight south, 15 miles in open country, to cross the Little Calumet River at what is now Dalton. And they crossed the Little Calumet River. They were traveling on the great Detroit to Chicago road. When the West was opening up, there were two great roads coming into our part of the world. And so folks coming west, and starting with the French and the English and then the Americans, they would get to Detroit, and then they would go by water up around Michigan and then come down Lake Michigan to Chicago. And other people came overland from Ohio and Indiana, came overland into Illinois. And the great thing that was going on was that this was the great constriction point, the great point of passage between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Valley. You may not know that we sit, actually right now, we are within probably a half mile of a continental divide. And it's a little cold, but if we all rushed out there, theoretically, and threw glasses of water, that water would eventually get into Thorn Creek and into Lake Michigan and go to the Atlantic Ocean. If we ran a half mile this way and threw our glasses of water, that water would go into eventually Hickory Creek and then the Illinois River and the Mississippi and go to the Gulf of Mexico. Thank you. I said, what? So we're sitting right on the continental divide. And that's why Chicago is so important, and that's why this is so important for freedom seekers. Because historically, all those people came from the east, funneled through Chicago, and so as freedom seekers came up the Mississippi River Valley, they had to funnel back this way. And in addition to Chicago, there was another key element, a thing called the Sauk Trail. And we all know the Sauk Trail, right up there. The Sauk Trail is hundreds of years old. It was developed by native people. There were great Indian cities along the Mississippi River. And as they were conducting business with the French and then the English and the Americans, they had to go back and forth to Detroit, which was kind of the center of colonial endeavors. And they went back and forth on the old Sauk Trail. And there were, like, what is it? A mile from here, 2 miles from here, somewhere between 500 and 800 freedom seekers came right there through our backyards on their way to freedom. And they didn't go to Chicago. They went straight east, and they were headed on the old Sauk Trail to get to Detroit and then across the river into Canada. Okay, now, a couple more framing things. Remember, the Civil War starts in 1861, and we know there were freedom seekers coming through this area as early as the 1820s. And so the bulk of activity was in the 1840s and 50s. So if you will, in the 20 years before the Civil War, they were heading forward. You know, I just realized there is not a clock here, is there? I'm going to pause, get out my
7:22.
phone. I'm going to get my phone so I need that.
And also, since we're streaming this live afterwards, we'll get a copy of all of Larry's slides and we'll post them.
Oh,
So everybody
okay,
will be able
okay,
to see it
okay.
afterwards.
Okay, great, 7:22. Okay. Okay, so the Great Sauk Trail was there. So we had 2 corridors of movement for freedom seekers that came out of the South. They came up and they went up into Chicago and then south around the bottom of Lake Michigan. And there were others that came up into our area and then came straight across in the Sauk Trail corridor. And again, don't think of these as exactly fixed routes, because depending on the time of year, the conditions of roads and so on, think of it more as a corridor. There were people that passed through extreme South Cook and eastern Will County, headed toward Detroit, and there were people that went up to Chicago and then came south around the lake. Now, over time, by the time we get in the 1840s, there were really developed networks all over northeastern Illinois because freedom seekers were traveling through. And a very active group of folks in Chicago got committed to helping freedom seekers. Now again, the traditional histories identifies, as a matter of fact, I've got a book that says this guy wrote this book in 1910, and he said, I've really studied the Underground Railroad in Chicago, and I've identified the 12 white men that ran it. Well, that's just not true. What we know now is that as Chicago grew in the 1830s, very small community, 10, 20,000 people, there was a very small black community. And there were a couple of young men who themselves had been enslaved. They found their freedom, they made it to Chicago, and they decided that they were going to help other freedom seekers coming through Chicago. And so we know that by 1938, there were some two black guys, both barbers, a guy named William Johnson and a guy named Louis Isbell. Right? You all know Louis Isbell, right? One of the most important people in the history of Chicago, and nobody's ever heard of Louis Isbell. A remarkable, absolutely remarkable man. Born in about 1818, he was born enslaved, and his master gave him his freedom, and he finally moved to Illinois and then worked his way to Chicago in 1838, and immediately started assisting freedom seekers who were coming through. Louis lived till 1905, and he knew everybody. He knew all of the black radicals and all the white radicals and all. He was in the middle of all of it, and nobody's ever heard of Louis Isbell. I have a picture of Louis I found. Also, at about that time, 1837, 1838, Chicago was a real boomtown, and there was a group of young white families that started running into, as freedom seekers came into town, came through Chicago, they started seeing them and realizing they had to respond. Now, there were people in Illinois and around the country who were kind of generally against slavery. Slavery's a bad thing, but that's in the South, and it's a bad thing. Then, among all, most people were anti-slavery. Then a much smaller number were abolitionists, people who decided politically, I'm going to work to end slavery, political activists. And then among the abolitionists, there was a very tiny number who decided that they were not only going to try to end slavery, they were going to break the law, and they were going to help freedom seekers. When fugitives came into town, they were going to break the law, because the law in America said it is against the law, it is illegal to assist people trying to find their freedom. So, by the late 1830s, there's a small group of white families, and they're just incredible. And again, part of the problem we have with this history is that the history only talks about the men. But of course, none of these guys could have done it without their wives and children. Because if you're inviting people into your house to help them out, everybody's got to be involved. And so there's this remarkable group of young white families, led by a guy named Dr. Charles Dyer. And Dyer was a real, just amazing character, and did a lot of really, really gutsy things. But these people all knew that they were breaking the law. Now, there had been Louis Isbell and a couple other black people that had involved in this process, and Chicago was so small, all these people knew each other. So already in the late 1830s, there were blacks and whites working together through the Underground Railroad. Then, in 1844, 1845, a remarkable group of young black families settled in Chicago. Some of them had come out of slavery, some of them were free people of color, but they also settled in Chicago. And fairly rapidly, as freedom seekers were coming to Chicago, they were connecting with this small group of black families. Remarkable leadership was provided by John and Mary Richardson Jones. And a lot of people have heard about John and Mary Jones. John was the first black elected official in Cook County. They actually were quite wealthy, and they were really, John and Mary were really the leaders of the black community. But they were accompanied by a remarkable group of additional folks. And again, some had been come out of slavery and others had been free people of color, but ended up in Chicago because Chicago had more opportunity for people of color than many other places in the country. And so nationally, people knew, black people knew, if you got your family to Chicago, you might have a better chance of finding a good life. And so over time, these black families with John and Mary Jones and others, by the way, Louis Isbell marries Mary Jones's sister. And so the Isbells and the Joneses are together, and then there's another fellow named Henry Bradford who marries Mary Jones's other sister. And so there are these three families, the Isbells, the Bradfords, and the Joneses, that really are providing major leadership for the city of Chicago. And I've got a whole cycles of stories about stuff that they went through, just great stuff. But so anyway, we have then hundreds of freedom seekers coming into Chicago being assisted by white and black activists. And these activists are working together. And again, it's a remarkable set of stories of interracial collaboration and stories that are kind of useful to remind ourselves that it really is a good thing for folks to be working together. One of the signs of this, when in the 1880s, when these folks started dying, the whites and the blacks, the pallbearers at the funerals were mixed. So, the black guys, they'd have white and black pallbearers, and the white guys that died, they'd have white and black pallbearers. It was a pretty remarkable set of connections. And again, I've got loads of stories about that. So when people got to Chicago, they had to go two ways. Either they could go on the lake, and there were a couple boats that had ship captains that were very willing to accept freedom seekers, or they would go overland. And in terms of going on the boats, just one quick story which I've always loved. Captain Walker of the steamship the Illinois would regularly get the fugitives on board, and they had, when the ships came up, there were steamers, and so they loaded lots of lumber to burn for the steam engines. And so they had working men, often a lot of working guys, black guys and white guys, who would load all the lumber. And so what they would do is that they'd bring up the freedom seekers, and then they would just put them in the line. And the guys would carry the load onto the boat, and then they just wouldn't come back. And they ended down to the bottom of the boat. Well, one time, Walker's got up on the main part of the ship, he's got some travelers, some Southerners who are doing the grand tour. They've come up the Mississippi River on a riverboat, and they've come up the Illinois River on a riverboat. And then they're going on the Illinois steamer up around to Detroit, and then they'll go on to New York and all that. So Captain Walker discovers that he, of course, has a fugitive down in the bottom of the ship that he'd snuck onto the ship. And he had these Southern gentlemen and their wives up on the top deck. And a steward comes and says, they're finding out about this guy. And so the captain stands and looks at all of his passengers, most of whom are Southern. So looks at all his passengers and says, my steward has just brought to my attention that we have a fugitive person in the bottom of the ship, and I want you to know I'm going to kick him off this ship the first opportunity I get. And hooray for the captain. He's not going to let this runaway be on the ship. So they've already gone around Michigan, and they're coming down Lake Huron, and the captain just steers over to the Canada side and stops at a little Canadian seaport, and he kicks the runaway off the ship. And everyone was really pleased, and it did dawn on some of them that, in fact, he'd kicked this guy into freedom. So anyways, but most of the folks came by land, either walked or went by buggy. They went straight south out of Chicago, and they had to cross the Little Calumet River at what is now the Indiana Avenue Bridge. That's the old Chicago to Detroit road. Now, those of you that know the south suburbs, remember, this is side note, historians. In Chicago, the whole street network is a grid pattern, right? What Monee is what, about 235th south? 235, 237? 260. Oh, okay, 260. Okay, well, you know, the grid pattern. If a road is not on the grid pattern, it's an old road. And you can, if you ever on an old road, for example, I live off of Old Monee Road, wiggles up toward Park Forest. Well, it's a wiggle. It's not a grid street. Well, that's an old native trail. And so anyways, if you think about the south suburbs, coming diagonal is the Michigan City Road, right? Why is it called the Michigan City Road? Because that is part of the old historic Detroit to Chicago highway that came south out of Chicago, went over through Hammond to Michigan City, and then on to Detroit. So whenever you are on the Michigan City Road, you are on the road that 500 to 800 freedom seekers took. I use the same estimate here and up there. So when people got to the Little Calumet River, there were some folks that would help them, assist them to get on their way into Indiana. After 1849, a group of Dutch immigrants came and settled in what is now Roseland and South Holland. And among those were two guys who could speak English. Cornelius Kuiper and his wife Marthe, and Jan Tun and his wife Anje. And they both spoke English. And so they were the ones that negotiated with people, and over time, they were the ones that were directly assisting freedom seekers. And right now, my biggest project that I'm working on is related to the Tun Farm site. And you'll see these pictures. See the old farmhouse right there on the Cal-Sag Channel? Right, okay. That farmhouse, so the next picture, this is Chicago's finest marina. This is the oldest black-owned marina in the Chicago metro area. And we discovered that a good chunk of the original home site for the Tun family is on the property of Chicago's finest marina. So I want you all to come visit sometime, and we're going to be doing tours, and we're hoping to put together some pontoon boats and go on, up and down the Cal-Sag Channel. Footnote, because of the Underground Railroad activity, and we're working closely with all these groups in Alkeld Gardens and nearby neighborhoods and that kind of stuff, we have helped to develop a thing called the African American Water Heritage Trail. It is the first African American trail on the water in the country. And you can go take a canoe or a paddle boat or a whatever, and you can go from Beaubien Woods along the Cal-Sag Channel to Robbins, and you can stop at about 20 places and learn about African American history in the south suburbs. And one of those sites is the Tun Farm. The Tuns the Tuns and Kuipers were very active in helping people that were coming through on the road. This has started to get some real press. We were interviewed and were on the BBC travel program in December. It was really cool. They came to my house and they, were sitting in my backyard and the cameras and the booms and all that kind of stuff. It's really cool. And then in January, we discovered that the New York Times every year publishes a thing, and you can go online right now and see it. The New York Times every year publishes a thing, 52 places to visit, one a week, 52 places to visit in 2020, in 2021. Their listing of 52 places to visit in 2022 includes number 29, come to the little Calumet River and see the Underground Railroad stuff and find out about African American history on the Calsac Channel.
Amen.
So that's pretty cool. We're really excited. So the South Suburbs has made the New York Times list. The Ton Farm on Little Calumet River is at the extreme southern edge of Chicago. Technically it's Chicago, but we can claim it. It's no problem. Okay, so folks came down, visited with the Kuipers and others, traveled on toward Indiana and freedom in Canada. And we know of a large number of folks that came up that river and over. Lord, I've got a lot of stories to tell. I've got to back off. All right, the second major route were people that came on the Sauk Trail corridor. Didn't go to Chicago at all. And there were a remarkable group of activists, particularly in Will County, that helped freedom seekers. Will County, by the way, our county, in 1837, Will County was the first county in northern Illinois to have an anti-slavery society. They were already assisting freedom seekers coming through in the mid-1830s. 1837, they formed the society. Reuben Beach and some of his cohorts. They came through. We know of significant activity that they were stopping in Lockport, in Homer Township, in New Lenox, in Mokina, and here in Park Forest, and also in Crete. And if you think about the next picture, is Sauk Trail crosses Western Avenue. You got that scene?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. On the, you can see, if you're looking north, we're looking north on Western Avenue, and here's the Sauk Trail in front of us. The northwest corner was the location of the Batchelder home, a gorgeous two-story home, and that was a stop on the Underground Railroad, right here. And then, if you go follow Sauk Trail, you'll notice the next slide is a picture of, if you go about a quarter of a mile east of Western Avenue, and the Sauk Trail kind of curves a little to the left, and then it goes right, and it goes across the little creek, little bridge there, that's Thorn Creek. Okay, as you come up the hill, if you look on the left, and while it's snowing, it really is obvious. You cross the creek, and as soon as you cross the creek, look on the left, and you'll see a little shelf of land. That was the location of the McCoy homestead. And the McCoys were just incredibly committed to assisting freedom seekers. And we know that well over 100 folks stopped with the McCoys on their way to freedom, coming across on the Sauk Trail, right there. And if some of you want to be really adventurous, we tried it last year. Come springtime, a bunch of you get together, I'll take you into the woods and we can see a little bit of a foundation of where this, where this all was. But and we've got very good documentation about the McCoys assisting freedom seekers. Now, also from that intersection with Western Avenue and Sauk Trail, there was a road that went toward, Old Richton Road. Some of you may know, once you get below Steger Road, you can find it. Old Richton Road went down and across to the area. You know where the new Coles is on 394?
Yeah.
Okay, that was the Coles sits on what was the Samuel and Elizabeth Cushing farm. And the Cushings were just fanatics about freedom. And they provided lots and lots of help for freedom seekers coming through. And so some freedom seekers, rather than going on the Sauk Trail, they would take this diversion, it was an old mail route, down on the old Richton Road, and they would go over toward Crown Point and then get back up toward the Sauk Trail corridor. But there was a whole group of families in Crete that assisted freedom seekers. The Cushings, and across the street was the Beebe farm, and just down the road was the Cook farm. And these people were just very, very important in terms of assisting freedom seekers to get through. Working with a bunch of those folks, I had the pleasure of, I just had a really great time working to put all that information together. All those families helped to start a congregational church in 1839. In 1842, that church was one of the very first in Illinois to issue an anti-slavery resolution that in terms of spirituality and religion and the demands of God, slavery is an evil thing. Also, that is a place where Caroline Quarles stopped. Yeah, okay. Let me say a few more things. I want to come back and tell you about Caroline Quarles. I've got two stories I want to tell at the end. Okay, so I think I've identified a number of the places around here where we know there was Underground Railroad activity in the Sauk Trail corridor, and then also in that corridor going up to Chicago and coming down and being helped by the Dutch and others to carry. And like I said, the great necessity was to get to freedom in Canada. I'd like to tell you three stories. I'll tell two, and if we're out of time, I'll skip the third, okay? The first story is Caroline Quarles. And some of you know this story. I read a book about Caroline. In 1843, Caroline was 16 years old. In 1843, she was enslaved in St. Louis, Missouri. And she grew up in the home of her white grandfather and her mother, who was a young slave. It seems that her master's son, when he was 28 years old and about to get married, decided he wanted to do some other things, and he had his way with a young slave woman named Maria, and the consequence was Caroline. Caroline grew up in this household with her white cousins who were free, and she was enslaved. Beautiful, long black hair, blue eyes, freckles, easily passed for white, and she was enslaved. Finally, at age 16, she'd had enough, and she decided to make her break for freedom. She went to the docks in St. Louis, conned her way onto a riverboat, rode the riverboat north to Galena, and got to Galena, and there's one black guy living in Galena. She gets off the riverboat, and the black guy comes and says, "You're passing. You're in deep trouble. We've heard about you. There are slave catchers coming for you. We got to get you out of town." So he helped her get on a stagecoach, ended up in Milwaukee. She was the first person of color, a fugitive that people in Milwaukee had ever seen. And they didn't know what to do with her. The whole series of remarkable things happened because slave catchers were hot on her trail, and they had to hide her. One day the slave catchers came into this building. They told her to jump into this old pickle barrel. It was empty pickle barrel sitting on the porch. She jumped into the pickle barrel and hid in there for a day while the slave catchers were marching around in the little town of Milwaukee. They finally figured out how to what they were going to do, and they designated one of the abolitionists in Milwaukee to be her escort, and they traveled by buggy, and they avoided the city of Chicago because of where the slave catchers were, and they came down through Elgin and Naperville and Lockport and over through Mokina and New Lenox, and they came on the Sauk Trail, and they stayed overnight with folks in Crete, Illinois. And then Caroline and her escort went on through northwestern Indiana to Detroit and on to freedom in Canada. A couple years after she got to Canada, she fell in love with a fellow named Allen Watkins, who had escaped out of slavery in Kentucky. And they married and had a really wonderful life together, 6 children. They helped to start a wonderful historic Baptist church in Sandwich, Illinois. And I have had the deep honor and pleasure of developing friendships with her 86-year-old great-granddaughter and one of her great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren who co-wrote a book with me about Caroline. Just a remarkable story, but can you imagine the courage of a young woman, 16 years old, 1843, deciding that her freedom was what was most important? And that's really gets to be a complicated story. The second story I want to tell you is about Henry Stevenson. In 1850, Henry was enslaved on a farm in central Missouri, and on the adjoining farm, a couple named Anthony and Martha decided to run for their freedom. And so they took off, they headed to St. Louis and beyond. Anthony and Martha's master came over to Henry's master and said, I need your help, we've got to go get Anthony and Martha back. And I want you to bring Henry, because Henry's a pretty smart guy. He might be a slave, but he's a pretty smart guy, and we need his help. Now, in the 1840s and 50s, a slave, average escaped slave, was valued at around $800. Today, that would be $15,000 to $20,000. Okay? So, Anthony and Martha's master was out $20,000 to $30,000. No, $30,000 to $40,000. So it was in his economic interest to go after his property. And they were going to bring Henry along. So they traveled across by horseback to St. Louis, and Henry went and talked. They checked with white authorities, and Henry went and talked in the black community. Henry comes back, and he says to his master and to Anthony's master, he says, they've been here. We know they've been here. I think they're headed for Chicago. Wow. Isn't it great to have a slave who helps out? So they get on a riverboat, and they go up the Mississippi, and they go up the Illinois River, and they stop at a number of towns, including Peoria. And every time they stop, they get off, they go and talk. The two masters go and talk to the sheriff and those kind of folks, and Henry goes and talks to the black community. And they come back, and Henry says, they've been here, but they're going to Chicago. Oh my God, that's Henry, thank you. We're hearing the same thing. So they get up to the I&M Canal. They get up to Ottawa, Illinois, and they're on the I&M Canal. And they're going on, and every town they stop at, they stop and go out and do this routine. And Henry talks to the black folks, and they always come back, and Henry says, they're going to Chicago. So they get up, and Henry's standing up on the ship, on the canal boat. And there's some Irish workmen on the banks. And they says, hey, fella, what are you doing? Oh, I'm working for my master. Don't you know that it's Northern Illinois? You can be free. Run away. And in the story, and Henry told the story, he says, I told him no. I wasn't going to run away. I'm working for my master. So they finally get to Chicago on the canal boat. And they get to Chicago, and Henry says, all right, I bet you they're here someplace. I'm going to go talk to people, talk to other blacks here in Chicago. And they were going to go talk to the sheriff and everything. Henry gets off, and there's a whole bunch of people at the canal boat landing. And Henry gets off the boat, and he walks up. There's a black guy sitting on a big wagon, a freight wagon. And Henry says, can you give me a ride into Chicago? The city itself was a couple miles from where the canal was. And he says, sure. He gets up, and the guy turns to Henry and says, what are you doing? Are you a slave? And Henry says, yeah, I'm a slave. And he says, well, don't you want to be free? And Henry says, of course I want to be free. And then the freight wagon driver says, well, I can take you to some folks. So takes him into town, takes him to this group of black and white abolitionists. They get off, they welcome Henry, and they say, gee, we'd be glad to help you, Henry, but we're a little short on cash. Henry says, I can get money. And he said, okay, then we can help you. Henry goes back down, gets in another wagon, goes back to the canal, goes on the canal boat, and he says, I think Martha and Anthony are right here. But to make it happen, I need a little money. And of course, good and faithful Henry. Of course we're going to give him some funds so he can make this all happen. So they give Henry some cash. Henry says, thank you very much, I'll be right back. And back he goes to the abolitionists, and they have the money, and they march right down to the wharf. They put him on a steamboat that goes, a coastal steamboat that takes him over to New Buffalo, and Michigan City and New Buffalo, and he gets on a train and gets to Detroit and freedom in Canada. You know, it's amazing. All of this is about journey stories. All of this is about the remarkable fact that in our common history, in the face of the most brutal kind of submission, there were people, individuals, families that found the courage to seize their own freedom and go for hundreds of miles. I won't tell you the whole story, but John and Eliza Little were enslaved in western Tennessee. They walked to the Ohio River, and they were determined to get to Chicago. And they walked, in the summer of 1841, they walked 370 miles to get to Chicago. I mean, we have dozens and dozens of stories. And so I ask all of you, when you hear and people talk about the Underground Railroad, remember, it's always freedom seekers and the Underground Railroad. It's always these remarkable stories of people that had the courage to find their own freedom. And they did it. Tragically, we don't know how many people tried and were killed, recaptured, taken back, but it is a remarkable part of our American history that there were thousands of people that found their freedom right through here. And I'm really glad to be part of the trying to reconstruct those stories and to share them with you. So that's it. Now, I'd love to take questions. And by the way, the last slide I'm going to put up. I generally don't have to be quite this blatant. But the last side comes up and it says, "Oh look, oh look, yes, this one you can have right now for $19, and this one for $21 right now. Right now." You want to look at that?
A discount
there
for
we go.
both?
Pardon?
It's a discount if you get both?
Well, it already is discounted. That's
Okay.
about that with with the taxes and stuff. It's about $4 off on each one. So, okay, questions. Do we have time for a few questions? Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned about through this area, what about the Brewery Mill? I've heard that was involved in the underground also.
Well, the Gravy Mill is a very interesting thing to talk about. They have a wonderful tradition of talking about, with Underground Railroad education. We're pretty sure that the people that ran the Gravy Mill were abolitionists, but there is no documentation that it was part of the Underground Railroad. And so that is with some of my colleagues, I have to be very careful and say, yes, let us honor that local tradition. But when the histories are written like mine, that's not in there because it wasn't part of it. Now, 2 miles away, there was a small settlement called Fullersburg, and there's some interesting evidence that freedom seekers came through Fullersburg. There is simply no evidence of freedom seekers at Gravy Mill, except this wonderful local tradition. And so we want to honor the tradition, and honor the good work that they're doing, but it technically is not part of the system.
Larry, any stories about the railroad over here? People following the railroad up here?
Oh, the Illinois, well, two real quick things. First of all, my research suggests that in excess of 100 people, freedom seekers, traveled on the Illinois Central, literally on the train. So the Underground Railroad was above ground. that from Cairo and areas down in Cairo. There's there are cycles of stories about that. There also is a cycle of stories about kidnapping gangs that would get on the train north of Cairo. Would any person of color they would grab, pull them off the train, and then sell them back into slavery. Pretty nasty business. In 1857, the kidnapping gang was on, and they saw this guy, fairly dark complected, big black mustache, and they grabbed him, and they took him to the sheriff and says, "We got another runaway slave. We want you to hold him till we can find their masters." And the guy kept the slave, the captive, kept protesting with a deep Irish brogue, saying, "My name is Thomas Leary, and I live in Chicago." And the kidnapping gang didn't believe him, and the sheriff was of mixed opinion whether this guy was black or an Irishman. And so they called the local state senator, another tribute to Illinois state senators. They called the local state senator, who came over to investigate. And he talked with Thomas OLeary. And he reported back to the sheriff, "Well, you might as well hold him. I mean, he's not black, but he's a pretty dumb Irishman, and that's close to being." Needless to say, this was front page news in Chicago. And the Tribune and others got high and mighty about this, and fairly soon Thomas Leary was freed and made his way back to Chicago. And it's a funny story, but that's not to belittle the fact that there's some just awful stories about people being pulled off the trains. The other fascinating story, Illinois Central story that I have, and again, this is very abbreviated. In the fall of 1860, a guy named Jordan Banks escaped out of Alabama, and he came up and he had heard. Remember, the Illinois Central was completed from Cairo to Chicago in 1855. So this is 1860. He's heard about the Illinois Central Railroad. So he works his way from northern Alabama through Tennessee and Kentucky, gets across the Ohio River, and north of Cairo finds the Illinois Central. But he's heard the kidnapping stories. And so Jordan Banks walked from Cairo to Peatone, next to the Illinois Central tracks. He walked the entire way. He got to Peatone, ran into a family named Dean, and incidentally, the Deans in Peatone had been part of that church in Crete that had done the anti-slavery thing. So he runs into the Dean family, and they say, "You come work for us." And he spent 2 months helping them bring him in the harvest in the fall of 1860. And then they gave him money and sent him on his way. He went up to Chicago, traveled by train to New York, went to Britain, wrote his autobiography, and his story is one of the standard autobiographies of freedom seekers in our American literature. Loads of things to tell. Yeah.
I'm a little curious about slave catchers coming all the way north. So if the person's in the north, weren't they then free? They could actually be taken from the north all the way back to the south?
Yes.
And that was the law even in the north?
Yes. The fugitive slave laws were fairly weak until 1850. And so Chicago, by 1850, Chicago had really established its reputation. And there were all these activists, in our area and in, along the Iron Canal and so on. So there was a very strong activist contingent, and you were pretty safe if you made it to northeastern Illinois. And there were a large number of folks that settled in Chicago. Large number, I mean like a couple hundred folks that instead of going on to Canada, settled permanently in Chicago. However, things got very serious after 1850. That was the passage of the incredible fugitive slave law. And remember the money stuff. It said the federal law was that if you were anywhere in the country and you assisted a fugitive slave, if you were caught and convicted, you could be fined $1,000. You know, it's like $15,000-$20,000. It's it's a lot of money. And it was definitely all of the laws were much stricter. They installed a commissioner system where there were people in each state who were overseeing the catching of fugitives. And there was this wonderful wrinkle in the law. If you were a court official and somebody came to you with evidence that this person was a fugitive, you looked at that evidence, and if you looked at the evidence and said, no, they're a free person, the federal government would give you an administrative fee of $5. You had to send in your paperwork, I evaluated this person, I said he was a free person, send me $5. However, the law said, if you're presented with a supposed fugitive and you look at the evidence and you decide that they are in fact a runaway slave, the federal government will give you an administrative fee of $10. Okay? That's federal law. And then, of course, in 1857, the great Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court took it upon itself to say, well, basically it's not possible for a person of color to be a citizen. So I guess, a lot of these things about the law are just mute. I mean, if a person is black, they're not a citizen, so if you want to capture them and take them to the South, that's okay. It was just incredible. Now, the reality is that in Northern Illinois and in Chicago, the abolitionist movement, that is the people opposed to slavery, and the activist movement, those few that were helping, were strong enough that they were able to protect folks. But it was very tricky, and there were slave hunting gangs and slave hunting teams in Chicago all the time. But the Underground Railroad was an open secret. Lots of times you hear stories about secret caves and tunnels and all that stuff. That's not true. There may have been places in southern Illinois and in the south where that was. But if anyone starts talking about a secret place, no. In northern Illinois, when people came through, they stayed in the spare bedroom, or they stayed out in the barn, or wherever visiting people would stay. There were not secret rooms. It was secret, but not totally secret. A few of you are old enough. This will be my final comment, I think. A few of you are old enough to remember in the 1960s this stuff about marijuana. Now, of course, none of you smoked, but everybody knew somebody, right? Remember? Oh no, that's illegal. We would never do that. But I know this guy who has a friend, and so if you need a little weed, you go over there. It was kind of like that. Everybody in Northern Illinois knew it was very much against the law, and they were not going to break the law. But, the Cushings down there in Crete, just go talk to the Cushings, or go to the Cooks, or go to the McCoys. Everybody knew somebody. And so even though it was illegal and it was very serious in terms of fines and so on, the systems in Northern Illinois were strong enough that they were able to circumvent the law. There was a tremendous belief that we are following a higher law. And it actually gets into the courts, that it's a kind of the higher law theory, that the human law says, slave and you got to do all this kind of stuff. But a higher law says these are human beings in need of help, and we will help them. And so and that's one of the reasons why the churches were such a hotbed of the activist stuff, because there were some people that took their religion seriously and said, geez, we got to help the stranger, and, all that stuff. So anyways, it's a fascinating round of stories, and there's 10 more to talk about, but I think I'm done and we're way over time. So anyways, it's great to be with you. Stay warm. And keep looking because, finally, please remember, I always learn new stuff. So like Christy says, maybe someday something is going to come up about some freedom seeker that jumped off the train in Monee and stayed with someone. The closest story I've got is the one in Piatone and the stories on Salt Trail. But maybe someday we'll get some info. So again, thanks. Great to meet you.
Thank you very much, Larry. I can say this is the third time that Larry has come and spoken for the Monee Historical Society, and it's just as fascinating the third time because every time he's here, he's got new stories. And I know we missed the graphics, but I got to tell you, because we didn't have the graphics, Larry could just fly right off, and you got a lot of really, really good extra stories that way. So it's a double-edged sword. It was pretty good, actually, anyway, that we didn't have the graphics. And as I said, they worked fine on my computer upstairs. We just couldn't scan them to
You
here.
gonna do this again Saturday?
No, Saturday we will have another presentation to do with Black History Month. We have someone coming who will talk about the secret meaning in quilts. She comes dressed as a Civil War person, and she'll talk about all the different signs that people would use to hang the quilts out so that you would know that this was a safe house to stop at. And then Abraham Lincoln will also visit and give us the Gettysburg Address and a few things like that. He's fascinating. He looks spitting image of Abraham Lincoln. So when you get home, if you will like us on Facebook, like the presentation, we can do more of it. As I said, this is our first try at it. And if you want one of Larry's books, I bought them last time he was around, and they are very fascinating. So do that. And if you're online, just contact the Historical Society, and we'll make sure that we can get you a book too. I think that's it. Please join us for refreshments, and Larry's